So when you look at sort of differentiating yourself away from your competition, how do you look upon differentiation? Is it to the services? Is it to do with the functionality, or is it usability? What is fundamentally important, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of differentiation, there's one key thing that sets us apart, and there's lots of other things. I won't bore you with all of them, but the key thing for us, and part of this has come from my experience that I had, was that schools or multi-academy trusts, which is our chosen demographic, our specific customer type is multi-academy trust. We don't have a channel for standalone schools or standalone academies. The product would work for them, but we know what we're good at, and we know the types of people that have the greater amount of pain that can be solved by what we do. And we're the only provider that only works with multi-academy trusts, and I think it's pretty unusual in the sector, and that's because people have been around for a long time, and they've had a system for 10 years. Well, MATs weren't really around 10 years ago, so of course people have built a school-based system and have tried to accommodate some MAT requirements with some functionality over the top, but that's always going to be perhaps more limited to putting the multi-academy trust front and center at the heart of the system. And that's a big fundamental difference between us and our competition. And secondly, I think our view of the problem is different because our system has been built for multi-academy trusts. What a school-based system has been designed to solve is perhaps different from the challenges that are then held at trust level. So our view is around, yes, we do the budgeting piece, which is creating a 5-year budget plan, but more often the pain involved within multi-academy trust finances is not setting that 5-year budget. It's actually in year saying, right, this is how we've got on year to date, this is where we're going for the rest of the year, and actually combining the 5-year budget planning process with the in-year forecasting process, with all the narrative and all the reports that come out the back of it, but just tying that up into one iterative process. So we call it continuous forecasting. So we don't have a budgeting process and a forecast, an in-year forecasting process. We've tied it all together. And as a result of that, so that approach is pretty unique. But because we've got so many data points driving our budget and forecast data, we've got a really rich data set across our entire multi-academy trust. So we've got all the pupil data, we've got all the detailed staff data, we've got all the income and expenditure, we've pulled in the transactional data from the finance system, we've pulled in the payroll data for the payroll reconciliation, and all of that data is in a naturally consolidated data model built specifically for a multi-academy trust. So, and that's a byproduct of the process that we need to go through to do all these other things. So we're doing some really cool stuff on the data side, and that's just meaning that with all this stuff that you're doing as part of that maintenance of the budget and the forecasting, look at all the byproducts you're getting in terms of FTE analysis and KPIs and pupils, and it's self-fulfilling because then people use the system more and want it to work better, then you get better data, and because it's cyclical, it's really driving some really great analysis and some great time saving for the customers that we have. And that it's a different thing from perhaps what other people offer. I'm sure they've got their views on how they're different to us, but that will be my view on how we're different to them. And the progress that we've had does seem to confirm that we've got something. We've got something that's different. It's not been sales and marketing that's got us where we've got to. It's been delivering a product that customers are happy with, that really solves a problem. And albeit the first 6 to 12 months was quite slow progress because people didn't necessarily realize they had the problem that they did, because the available options to solving it were all of a muchness. You almost had to, if you said, oh, how do you find your budget? And they go, yeah, it's fine. And then you ask them a few questions around, oh, how do you do this? How do you do this? How do you do this? And you just see, they almost saw their face change as they start answering, thinking, actually, it's not that great, is it? But because the only solutions they had available were quite similar, they weren't even seeing some of these things as problems. So I think it was a risk, solving a problem people didn't realize they had. And that could have gone one of two ways, granted. But that problem is resonating, and I think that's been a big driver for what we've done.
Yeah, but I think most people or most customers, if they have got a pain point and you can deliver that awareness of the fact they've got the pain point, then then normally stands up for a very strong business, because ultimately you are going into quite a niche scenario, and ultimately going into a saturated market is one of the worst places to end up, because obviously you're fighting with everybody else, and and you've got to be careful not to get to a commoditized product, which then you're fighting on price. So, you know, it sounds like, you know, again,
Yeah.
you know, you've looked at where, you know, where you can be niche, you know, without trying to, you know, replicate what other people were doing. So
We haven't tried.
Point.
I don't think we've tried to solve a problem that doesn't exist either. You know, we deliberately chose this because we felt the size of the problem warranted a solution, and it can be tempted to build a solution you think is quite cool and then try and fit that to problems that perhaps might not exist. Yeah. And that is a real challenge. I think it's difficult to get progress if you've got a lot of similarity. You've got to be really different and really easily describable differences that people recognize, not just you recognize, but actually the market can recognize. You know, people go on our website and we'll get a contact request and say, wow, I didn't know you existed. You know, so I would go to our marketing team when I say that, but oh, I've never heard of you. But those are exactly the pain points we're having. They have a demo and we perhaps have a contract the next day or the day after. And that's been pretty unheard of in most businesses that I've worked with. But the problem is so well defined and we solve it in such a clear way that people are often aware now, probably aware they've got the problem, whereas they weren't probably 2 years ago.
Yeah, and you shall go your marketing team, because ultimately it sounds like the actual message is very clean. You know, one of the thing is, if you confuse customers, they also find it hard to buy because, you know, they don't really understand what you're trying to sell them in some ways.
That is easier as a new business where we've got one customer type and one product. You know, it gets harder when you've got different customer types, different products. We can be so specific on all of our marketing. It does make that a bit easier.
Yeah, amazing. Oh, wow. So, one of the other questions is probably is very much on that sort of so regarding the CFOs or your customer base. So actually we're about to do a bunch of sessions on MATs as well, MAT leaders. So it'd be really interesting. Where do you see the main pain points then, for especially after all the COVID's been happening? You know, there's now, you know, they're having to do more blended learning. You know, so from a financial perspective, do you think, you know, where do you think the biggest pain points are for CEOs and CFOs?
I think the biggest challenge within finance is actually a problem that's not within finance. So we've done a whole piece of work around kind of gag pooling and centralization and how to do finances differently. But that in itself is not a finance process. It's an organizational strategy piece, cultural piece. And I think sometimes there's a detachment between the two, and it's very difficult to instigate a program of whatever that might be, whether it's centralization, decentralization, gag pooling or not. If that's seen as a finance task, that's got to tie into the overall organization strategy. And I think there's still some bad news around gag pooling, and yeah, I get it, it's got a bit of a bad name, but I think there are some challenges just around MATs defining their why. You know, because just being a MAT for the sake of being a MAT, so you've got extra fees for a CEO, a CFO and an audit, you know, doesn't necessarily achieve that much. And there's a constant battle, and I know a lot of CEOs and CFOs struggle with this, the relationship between trust and school. And it's saying, well, we can't ask that of our schools because we said everybody join us and nothing will change and you can do what you want and it will be a merry experience. And you know, that might not be the case, and there's other people in the other camp saying, well, no, we are, you know, militant, we've had a load of sponsored schools that we've had to turn around and we tell them exactly what they need to do. There's such variety out there, and you know, we see people talk about gag pooling, but the local context is so important in understanding whether people can get there or not. So I mean, that's a really kind of waffly answer on the problem that MATs are facing in terms of strategy. From a systems perspective, I think there is a tussle at the moment between, do we go integrated system from one provider, or do we go best of breed? And I've got some strong views on this, as you can imagine, Nick, and I'm sure some other people will have some other views on this. And I think that ultimately, I think if they could go to one provider that could provide them systems that ultimately did the job and they all talk to each other, absolutely, and that provider could give good service and good pricing, who wouldn't go for it? I think the challenge for all of these organizations that are creating these solution suites are all of those points. And I don't think anyone's there yet. I think there's some interesting new additions to the race that have got a different approach, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
But for me, judging what's out there from a systems perspective, people need to find the right tools for the job, and actually systems should interoperate with each other. It should be open APIs. I mean, when we started our business, we used stuff like Zero and MailChimp and Pipedrive. We go to the App Store and we plug in all sorts of other bits and pieces, and that's plugging into 100 different applications. Within the kind of the education space, there's a fairly limited set of applications. So it shouldn't be difficult to drive integration between systems. The only thing holding it back is whether people, providers want to make it easy for the data to go elsewhere.
I fundamentally agree with you. I think the data itself, I think, the more that the data is available, the more that can be then delivered as insights for the customer base, and that has to be the end goal, really. I appreciate people have all their commercial reasons for not necessarily integrating with each other, but actually, if you want to look at it from the best possible outcome for schools and MATs and everybody associated in education, the best thing is much more of an open sort of API sort of approach, as you mentioned.
I think that's good for customers, and it perhaps not be as good for providers, because it does open up the landscape. I mean, if you're relying on not sharing data to keep hold of your customers, you've probably got something else wrong, because you should be relying on the strength of your product, the quality of your service, actually the problem you're solving. And if that's good, send your data wherever you want, because people are getting a good service and they've got a good product. If you've not got some of those things, then I understand it, but it doesn't feel like the right way to go for customers. And ultimately, customers will win. Customers will always win, because there's always going to be a new person that's going to give the customer what they want. So, anyway, I'm obviously not the most objective person on this debate.
I don't know. I think you're right. I think ultimately, it's you should never look backwards at your competition and say, "Oh my God, they're catching up. How do I now stop them from catching up?" You should really be thinking along the lines of, how do I now progress to a speed where they are still behind me? They should always be in your ultimate. I know it's a bit of a utopia, but they should always be in your rear view mirror, rather than just catching up alongside, where you're going, how do I stop them? How do I stop them from being innovative while I can't?
And it takes a long time. You can't just be innovative like that. It's structural, it's cultural, and you've got to have a lot of those things in place for a long period of time to actually deliver innovation. You can't flick a switch and turn innovation on. Despite what marketing can do, you can turn on innovation overnight, but there is a time where actually the reality's got to catch up with the marketing, and that's where we're lucky, because we don't really have much marketing, so we haven't got much to follow, because we haven't got much marketing presence.
Well, I agree. It's interesting, because it goes back to when we were just talking about the overall proposition that you deliver, because you're looking at how do you engage your customers better, how do you make sure you're differentiating yourself across and being niche, and actually marketing is the same part. It has a part to play in that differentiation. There's so much marketing, I think, sometimes out there, which talks about, we're going to save you money, we're going to help you improve your people's performance, we are going to save you time, and you just go, wow, if everybody's doing the same bit of marketing, if I was a customer going, I don't know which one to pick, I just can't go for the cheapest, because this is now becoming confusing and a bit sort of me too.
And I think there is a difference as well between what MATs are looking at in general terms. I think there's a difference between the expertise that's available within multi-academy trusts and perhaps the expertise available within standalone schools. And in a standalone school, if you can get 80% functionality, one provider, and it kind of fits, and you've got to do a bit manually outside in Excel, you're going to take that. But I don't think it's the same approach when you're across 30 schools, 20 schools, and you've got 50 people interacting with the system and all doing their own manual things in spreadsheets. That's a very different beast to that position in a school. And the market's changing, and we will see. I did see that Gavin was talking about maths in Schools Week last week, around they want to see many more schools in maths. So I think it's stagnated a little bit in the market. It's been nobody's quite sure where the strategy is going for the sector, but it does look like momentum is going back in the direction of multi-academy trusts again, which will be interesting.
I think there's been two statements since COVID started, which was very much, this is our policy. This is the direction of travel. I think that obviously they've been tied up with other things going on at the moment, but I think you're right. I think when they come out of this, I can't see them stopping going down this sort of multi-academy trust approach. Even if Labour get in, I can't see them reverting it. So it's too embedded now. It costs too much money to take out. Going back to the sort of, I suppose one of the things. So you spoke about how best of breed. I suppose the one thing regarding the price point is I do know some Mats who have sort of gone, we didn't understand the shortfalls of this, one-stop shop sort of type of approach. However, we could get in a data analyst, and they're cheap enough to basically still deliver what we need to deliver with that system, without us having to buy a more expensive one. So I suppose it all really does tie into that return on investment.
Yeah, pricing is an important part of that as well. Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention it, but of course that's part of the equation. And yeah, I mean, staff cost is the most expensive cost there is. Relatively, even in terms of systems, a staff member cost is normally quite a lot of system. But yeah, I mean, there are times where a person can plug a gap. But you've got to be a fairly decent sized trust where a person is less than the cost of a system differential, and you're buying big systems. So yeah, it's an important equation that is part of that discussion. You're right.
You've got to keep mindful. And also going back to that sort of platform piece that you're talking about, where there's APIs that everyone's interacting with data. I suppose what it would do is enable you to think wider with your analysis potentially. And I'm guessing some of the analysis that you do already, potentially, what the cost of certain subjects are and so on, that would help with the budgeting and planning going forward. And I'm not saying, I don't know if you do that already, but that's the sort of, I suppose, the analysis that would be useful for budgeting.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this because I'm a boring old accountant, but a database built for numbers is quite a good database for other data sets, because if you think about it, we've got fields for all schools, we've got fields for what type of field is this and what department is this field linked to, but we've also got monthly values and annual values. So it's a really nice framework to drop in additional data sets, and it's quite early that we've started looking at that, but an accounting database is a nice pre-made model, and it doesn't do things like terms, because term is a non kind of distinct period, whereas finance is in months. But yeah, it really is an interesting area for us that we can overlay additional information. And for us at the moment, we're limiting that to what is useful. We don't just want to build up loads of data for the sake of it, but it is an interesting piece for us.